Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Courtney James, Marketing and Sales Development Rep for Solutions for Networks. I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar about VMware to Hyper-V. So with the acquisition of VMware, licensing and costs are predicted to increase, and a lot of customers are evaluating whether now is the right time to switch or not, and they're evaluating other solutions. So we're here to explore what it looks like to transition from VMware to Microsoft Hyper-V. Our speaker today is Tim Beamer. He is Solutions for Networks CIO. Feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A at any time during the presentation. And without further ado, Tim, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Courtney. So I've been in the industry for a long time now, over 31 years. And I've worked with VMware for a large part of my career, but I've also worked with other solutions as well when we look at things from a hypervisor lens. Today's presentation, we're gonna focus on the options from a migration perspective in terms of Microsoft. So we'll look at Hyper-V, we'll look at Azure Stack HCI, we'll also look at potentially even moving to Azure as some of the options that you have. And by no means are those the only options that are available to you. There's other hypervisors out there. There's stuff that Citrix is doing. There's stuff that other vendors like Nutanix is doing. But we're going to focus on the Microsoft lens right now as we go through today's presentation. As Courtney mentioned, as we go through this, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get them answered. So let's get going. So today what we'll take a look at, we'll talk about V-Day and what that means. We'll look at some of the options that are out there. And we'll also look at what the migration scenarios look like. So not each option looks the same when we talk about what it looks like in terms of migration. There's different ways to do it depending on which direction you're headed. And some of those things are a little bit easier than others. And there's some new functionality that Microsoft's rolled out within one of their tool sets. We'll talk about that as well as we go through today. So V-Day, 11/22/2023, a little over a year ago. Broadcom acquired VMware, and a lot of the news that we're seeing is that people are a little unhappy about the way the transition's headed. They're moving from a perpetual licensing model to a subscription model. That shouldn't be a shock to anybody. If you look at the way the industry is going today, pretty much everything's going to a subscription model. Microsoft started doing it back in, let's say, the 2008 timeframe, when they released Business Productivity Online Services, or what we now call M365. Adobe has gone to a subscription model. And that's not anything that's unusual. It seems to be the way of the world from a licensing perspective, but it is a change in terms of how you handle licensing. So instead of a one-time CapEx that maybe you do every 3 or 5 years, now it's an OpEx model where you're paying for it on a monthly basis. They're also bringing back something that they had way back in the waybacks with licensing tiers, either vSphere Standard or vSphere Enterprise Plus. And there's differences in terms of some of the capabilities of the technology, and that creates some consternation as well. What we see is, as with many vendors, of course, having dealt with Microsoft licensing for as long as I have, we all know that's the easiest thing in the world to understand. But their licensing models are getting a little more complex. What I've seen in the press, I've seen licensing costs increase 150%, 300%, maybe even 500%, depending on what options organizations are looking to go with. And this is based on what I'm reading in the press. Your mileage may vary, but the licensing changes and the way the licensing model works and the price changes for some customers was pretty abrupt. Based on when the acquisition went through. Other customers were on longer term contracts and still had time, at least until the end of their current contract. And that bullet point on pricing, that came from CIO.com, and that was published back in the beginning of July of this year. So I think everybody's still trying to figure out what this all means from a pricing perspective, and maybe it is time to move. This is one of the trigger points that's kind of pushing that in that direction. So you have options. The question is, what's the right option for your organization? One of the options is you don't do anything. And you stay on VMware and you take whatever that hit is on cost. Sure, that's a I'll say that's a lower barrier point because you're already on the platform and all you're doing is paying more money for it. But when you start to look at that from a long-term perspective, is that the right move? Are there better ways to do it where, yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of a change in terms of my operating model and potentially how I license things, but it's going to be less expensive. And when I look at that in the long term, it actually becomes a less expensive option going forward. The other thing is you can look at an alternate hypervisor. We're going to focus on Hyper-V today. That's the Microsoft offering. But there are other options that are out there. Like I mentioned before, there's an option from Citrix. There's an option from Nutanix. There's other options on the market. But we're going to focus on Hyper-V. And there's a big reason for that is because if you're on an enterprise agreement with Microsoft or you've licensed Microsoft Windows Server Data Center, you already own the hypervisor. You actually don't need to buy a hypervisor if you don't. Also, when we look at this from the perspective of what the options are, does it make sense to start to look at, do we move some of those workloads to the cloud? This could be an inflection point to actually kind of kick things into gear and say, maybe it's time for us to look at how we're going to decommission our on-premises environment or our colo environment and move to an operating model where we're going to go take advantage of what's available to us from an Azure cloud perspective. Of course, there's other cloud environments as well, but we're going to look at Azure. And then there's hyper-converged options or HCI options. And we'll take a look at a couple of those as well. So ultimately what it comes down to is, what's it all going to look like if I decide to migrate? So from a Hyper-V perspective, that's the Microsoft Hypervisor. It's included in the operating system. If you're licensed for Windows Standard Server, you get 2 VMs per host. If you're licensed for Windows Enterprise Server, you can put as many virtual machines on that host as it'll take. There is no limit from a licensing perspective to the number of guest VMs you can have on a Windows Enterprise or Data Center server. So basically, Microsoft is saying, you license Enterprise or Data Center, we're going to license it based on the core count in the box. And based on that, however many VMs you think you can throw on there and have them run efficiently, you can put them on there. 2, 5, 10, 20, 50, 100, whatever that looks like. And of course, that depends on the hardware stack behind it. But the idea is you're not limited from a licensing perspective. And you license Windows Data Center per core for the host, and you're done. Every time you add another VM on there running Windows Server, it's already licensed. The management plane is a little different. Microsoft rolled out a tool set a while back called SCVMM, or System Center Virtual Machine Manager. That's the management plane. That's what you're used to in VMware today as vSphere. So that's where you have your golden images for rapidly deploying servers. That's where you manage how you're going to allocate memory and CPU. That's where you manage if you're going to use live migrate from host to host to move a VM while it's running without any downtime. That can all be done through SCVMM. And again, if you're a customer who is licensed via an enterprise agreement, you probably already own that. You probably have the cows for it. It's just a matter of standing up the server. There's no special hardware requirements from a Hyper-V perspective. So you go out, you buy a commodity server, you throw a Windows Data Center server on it, then you're good to go. So there's no necessity to have a quote unquote certified platform, which we'll see a little bit later when we talk about Azure Stack HCI. It's a little bit of a different model, and there's some reasons behind that. We'll talk about that when we get there. But from a Hyper-V perspective, any host that can run Windows Server can run many VMs as you can put on it if you're licensed for it. So that lowers that barrier in terms of a cost of entry. Now, again, with Hyper-V, you're assuming that everything's going to stay on premises, and that's okay. And there may be workloads that you have in your environment today that need to stay on premises for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons to keep a workload on premises is not security. It's easier to secure a VM environment doing infrastructure as a service in Azure than it is for us to apply the same level of security and monitoring from an on-premises perspective. So I've heard the argument for years. we can't move this because of security reasons. Security is not a reason. Security is an excuse, if you will. And again, I've had that conversation with moving things into Office 365, security, blah, blah, blah. It's actually easier for us to secure workloads in the cloud, whether they run in Azure or whether they run in M365. Putting that security platform in place is a lot easier in the cloud than it is for us to do it on premises. From an Azure perspective, what if we decide maybe it's time for us to look at cloud? Maybe we really need to look at what we can do from Azure. So that's a migration to cloud. And there's a couple ways to do that. There's what's referred to as lift and shift, or you can do lift and modernize. Well, lift and shift is really, you're just going to take the VMs that you have in VMware today, you're going to pick them up from your VMware environment, and you're going to drop them into Azure as infrastructure as a service. Now, mind you, I make that sound really easy. There's a lot of back-end work that you need to do to be ready to do that. We refer to it as laying down a landing zone. That's based on Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework. So there's work that needs to be done to get that Azure environment ready for those VMs. But the idea is that we're really not going to change much from the perspective of those VMs. Really, all we're going to do is pick them up from one place, we're going to drop them in another place and continue to run. Lift and modernize is a little different, because when we look at lift and modernize, now we're going to really take a look at those workloads and see, there's probably some options that we have in Azure that will allow us to run those more effectively and more efficiently, and also at a lower price. Many organizations I've talked with over the last 31 years have SQL all over the place. Probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I did a SQL assessment for a customer. They had 65 different SQL instances in their environment. That's not effective, that's not efficient, and that's really expensive from a licensing perspective. So at the time, we were looking at consolidating down to a smaller number of SQL servers on premises. Today, one of the things we can also do is look at, does it make sense, or do we need to have a full-blown SQL server to run this? Because SQL is one of the options that's available to us in platform as a service in Azure. And running a SQL instance in platform as a service versus running SQL Server as a VM in Azure, the price points are vastly different. You can save yourself about 70% by moving it to SQL platform as a service. So there's better ways to do it. Question is, do we lift and shift and then modernize, or do we look at modernization as part of that migration to cloud? Licensing, of course. We got to talk about licensing. We got to talk about licensing with everything. So let's talk about licensing. When you look at it from an Azure perspective, there's a couple different ways to do it. There's what they call pay-go, pay-as-you-go. Pay-as-you-go means I stand up a server, I pay for it every month, whatever that run cost is, depending on how many CPU cores are in it and how much memory it has and the amount of disk behind it. The bill comes every month, I pay for the whatever. You can also do what's called committed instance. A committed instance basically means I'm going to commit to running this server in Azure for X number of years. It's either 1 or 3 years. And if you commit to running that, because you're making it easier for Microsoft to do capacity planning with respect to their Azure cloud, they're going to give you a break on the price. If you do a 1-year commit, you're looking at about 25 to 30% saving every year. If you look at a 3-year commit, that can go upwards of 50 or 60%, depending on various parameters around what goes in that VM. But the idea is you're committing to Microsoft, I'm going to run this for either 1 year or 3 years. And based on that, Microsoft's going to give me potentially a pretty significant break on the price. For your instances that you can't commit to, there's also something called an Azure Savings Plan. If you set up an Azure Savings Plan, again, you're committing to running X number of CPU cycles and X amount of memory and X amount of disk. And based on that, they'll also cut you a break on the price. It's not as dynamic, it's not as drastic, rather, as a committed instance. But the idea is there is a way to save money, even on things that you potentially have in a pay-go setup. The other thing you need to consider is Azure ready for you? If you're running M365, you already have an Azure tenant. You might not have anything in there other than directory services to support M365. The reality is you already have an Azure tenant. in order to get ready to migrate services into it, or VMs or whatever, we need to look at things like connectivity. We need to make sure there's a landing zone developed, and that landing zone needs to be architected appropriately. One of the mistakes that we've seen customers go through many times over the past year is they think that they can architect an Azure environment the same way they architect an on-premises data center. And it doesn't work that way. You're going to end up spending more money than you expected to. You're not going to get the savings you think you might. And quite frankly, it's going to be a lot more expensive and complicated to own, operate, and maintain. So by architecting appropriately using the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, we can set up an environment that's going to be a lot more efficient, it's going to be a lot more effective, it's going to be a lot more secure, and it's going to be easier to own, operate, and maintain long term. It's going to be much better for you. So when you start to look at how you're going to set up an Azure environment, if potentially you're going to migrate services out there, and maybe it's some and maybe it's all, whatever, the idea is we want to make sure we have the architecture laid down and the Azure landing zone set up appropriately so that as you move those workloads in there, they're secure, they're set up efficiently, they're set up effectively, and they'll work well for you. From a migration tooling perspective, yeah, you got to have some kind of migration tooling. There's a couple different ways to do it. There's some new tools available. Microsoft has released an appliance-based solution called Azure Migrate. When I say appliance, we're not talking like a toaster or a refrigerator or something you got to move into your data center. It's a virtual machine that they've put together for you. And it's packaged with all the tooling you need to migrate your on-premises servers directly into Azure. It also has some really good capabilities up front prior to migration to go through your existing on-premises environment, do some assessment work, and help us understand, what servers really aren't ready for us to move to Azure, or are there servers that won't even be supported in Azure? All that information and all those capabilities are available to us through the Azure Migrate appliance, and it makes it a lot easier for us to understand what's running in your environment, what kind of dependencies are there. That's one of the things that the Azure Migrate appliance will map out for us really well. And by dependencies, I mean I have this application server, and when this application runs, it needs to be connected to this database, and it needs this web server for the front end. The Azure Migrate appliance helps us figure that out so that when we're putting together a migration plan, we don't want to migrate the database and not migrate the application server and the web front end at the same time. We want to do that all at the same time so that those services are all within proximity to each other so that the application runs as best as it can. So understanding all that up front, when we look at migrations, that's one of the things we need to do up front is make sure we assess and understand what's in the environment, what are the dependencies, which servers rely on services that are on other servers, and how do we make sure we account for that when we put together that migration. One of the other options you have is called, let me rephrase. It's formerly known as Azure Stack HCI. It was actually on Microsoft's website this morning, and it looks like they're going to change the branding, and it's going to be called Azure Local. Call it whatever you want. 3 months from now, they'll change the name again. But the reality is we refer to it as Azure Stack HCI right now. And what that is a hyper-convergent environment that's put together and certified by Microsoft. It's pre-configured. You're buying that as a unit from a vendor. It's got certified compute, it's got certified storage, it's got certified networking, all that's built into the platform. And there are multiple vendors out there that provide these. So it's not like I have to go to one vendor and that's the only vendor that we can work with. Cisco has an HCI environment. HPE has one. Dell has one. Lenovo has one. You go out to the Microsoft website, there's Azure Stack HCI environments from vendors I've never even heard of before. There's plenty of options out there. Now, of course, if you've got a certain environment in place in your organization today, maybe you're a Cisco shop and you've used Cisco HyperFlex before. Maybe you're an HPE shop and you've used HPE's HyperFlex environment or Dell's hyperconverged environment, whatever. You can look to see if they have an Azure Stack HCI certified platform as well, which again, if you're comfortable with somebody's hardware, that's fine. We can work with whatever. The idea with Azure Stack HCI is it's giving you an option to have an on-premises footprint, but also have it directly connected to Azure from the on-premises environment. When I say on-premises, that also includes co-location environments as well. But the idea is that that environment is now directly connected to Azure. So if you need to do things like plan for migrations from on-premises into the cloud in the future, your platform's set up to make that a lot more simplified, straightforward, and streamlined. If you need to flex from a capacity perspective, if I need the ability to have additional server heads come online for some web application that's going to get hit real hard a couple times during the year, I can flex that out to the Azure environment to get additional capacity on demand and only pay for it while I'm using it. It also gives you the ability to leverage ASR, or Azure Site Recovery, to do a direct failover into Azure for disaster recovery scenario. So the idea is now we're going to automate the process to say, I need to flip the switch from my on-premises environment that's my day-to-day operational environment, but in the event of a disaster, I need to flip that up to Azure in a very rapid fashion. And ASR, in conjunction with Azure Stack HCI, can do that in a very streamlined fashion. Think about some of the weather events that we've had this year and some of the organizations that nobody ever expected to be impacted by a hurricane that were. If they were in an Azure Stack HCI environment, they could have flipped all those over directly to Azure. And again, it would have been a zero downtime event for them. Yeah, you can run in Azure as long as you need to. And then when your site is available for you to move back into it, maybe you need to put new hardware in there based on whatever happened in the environment. But the idea is you can connect to it and move those workloads back down to an on-premises environment very easily if you need to, post-disaster. So it gives you a lot more options in terms of how do I architect for an on-premises environment, but still have that option and still have that forward look to say, maybe in the future, we're going to be ready to move this stuff into the cloud. So we want to be prepared for it. Azure Stack HCI makes it a lot easier to make that jump in the future. So what do the migration scenarios look like? Well, let's take a look. Let's assume that you're going to stay all on premises and you're just going to move straight from VMware to a straight Hyper-V environment. Well, there used to be a really good tool out there called the MVMC. It was the Microsoft Virtual Machine Converter. And it was great for doing one at a time kind of migrations from VMware to Hyper-V. Microsoft deprecated that. It's no longer supported. You can't even find the download link. I'm sure somebody has it out there on a mirror server somewhere, but can't get to it from the Microsoft site. And a lot of organizations tried it and it worked fine and there was nothing wrong with it, but it's no longer supported. The way forward today is if you're going to stay all on premises, you implement SCVMM, System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Great thing about System Center Virtual Machine Manager is that it will manage both your Hyper-V environment and your VMware environment. So now I can look at both environments in one pane of glass. It provides me with the migration tool set I need to move those workloads from VMware to Hyper-V. And in the future, once I've decommissioned my VMware environment, SCVMM is going to be the management plane, as I mentioned earlier, for my Hyper-V environment. So really what we're looking at is we're going to put a tool in place, and yes, it's going to enable us to do the migration, but it's also going to be a management tool going forward. So it's not like a one and done kind of migration tool. The way SCVMM is architected today is you can do up to 10 parallel migrations per host, and you can do up to 100 total parallel migrations across multiple hosts. So again, the idea is we're going to provide you with a tool set that allows you to migrate a lot of workloads in a short amount of time based on the performance of the hosts behind them. Now, can I migrate 100 virtual machines at a time? Sure. Should I? Probably not. Whenever you start to look at your migration scenarios, migration planning becomes absolutely critical. You're going to want to do a pilot or a test migration. Let's make sure the tooling is set up. Let's make sure it works the way it's supposed to. Let's make sure that when that guest OS gets to its destination, that it powers up and it does all the things that it needs to do and can connect to everything that it needs to connect to so that it's a seamless migration. Should I do this in the middle of the day? Probably not. Could you? Yeah, you could, but I don't recommend it. there's going to be downtime moving from a VMware environment to Hyper-V. It's not going to be a live migration. It's not going to be a live motion kind of. So the VM will need to be powered down to make that migration go over because you're changing the format of the file behind that virtual machine. So there's things to be aware of there. And again, planning becomes critical. And that's one of the things that we do very well is plan these migrations out, go through the testing, make sure everything works. If something doesn't work, let's figure out where it's broken, why it's broken, and how we get it fixed. That way, when we do start to do migrations at scale, we don't have massive outages in the environment. Again, as I mentioned before with SCVMM, if you have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, you probably already own the licensing for it. So licensing becomes less of an issue. Now, you could use PowerShell. I don't recommend it because I'm going to tell you right now, we'll see it a little bit later, but that command line to do this via PowerShell is pretty complex. I've been doing PowerShell for a while, and when I look at it and say it's complex, you know it's complex. There's also a third-party tool out there called Disk2VHD. I say third-party. It's actually developed by someone who's very senior at Microsoft. Again, I look at that as more of I want to do one at a time, and I have a very small environment. I wouldn't necessarily look to use Disk2VHD as a tool to be able to migrate at scale. So something to be aware of. Yes, it's out there, but if you're going to do scale migrations where you're migrating multiple VMs at a time, that's not the way to do it. So let's look at SCVMM. So when we start to look at it, the first thing you need to do is you've got to get it connected to both environments. It has to talk to VMware. It has to talk to Hyper-V. And of course, you know, there's username and password, and we got to verify our credentials, make sure all that's set up. Then once we do that, we're going to connect to the vSphere environment. Once we've connected to vSphere environment, now we'll be able to see both environments. And one of the things you can do is make sure that all that communication is secured like it should be based on certificate verification, so that we know that the VMs that we're picking up, VMs that we're putting down, have all been transited in a secure fashion. I'm going to bop through these screenshots pretty quick. So here's where we're going to import that machine certificate to make sure we can secure all of our communications from one environment to the other. And then once we do that, and we've connected to vSphere, now we'll start to connect to the various ESXi hosts. That gives us visibility into each host to see what guest operating systems are running on it. And then we can start to look at how we're going to migrate. Again, credentials to be added in to make sure we can connect to both environments. Once I see that, I can see those target resources, and I can grab a hold of what I need to migrate over. And then I can set up the host settings in there as well. So some pretty quick screenshots to go through that. I didn't want to belabor the point, but the idea is there is a very well documented and very prescriptive process to make sure we go through this and connect the two environments and get them working together the way they should. Again, we want to make sure that communication is all secured. We do it with certificate level authentication between the two machines, or between the two environments rather. So this is all set up to make sure everything works the way it should. Some key conversion steps you need to be aware of when we're using SCVMM. Number one, we have to stop the VM in VMware before it can be converted. Then it can be converted, and we'll select the VMware source instance. We'll specify what the server identity is, so we'll need to give it a machine name and description when we drop it into Hyper-V. Please, please, please. I've worked in dozens and dozens and dozens of environments over the years. I hope that your server names are not associated with things like Star Wars characters, NASCAR racetracks, Simpsons characters, whatever. Your server nomenclature should be reflective of the location and the functionality of the server. It should make it easy for an admin to figure out what that server is doing. When you have a server called Daytona, you have no idea what it does. And the person who comes in and takes over that environment for you after you've retired or won the lottery, they're going to have no idea how to figure out what each server does, other than spend a lot of time going through them, because most environments I've been in as well are poorly documented. So let's make sure we understand from a server name perspective, servers are named based on location and functionality. Make sure we understand what the configuration needs to be. So how many CPU cores are we using? How much memory is associated with it? Then we're going to select a target. And the target is at the host level, even though those hosts may be clustered. So we'll look at where are we dropping this thing in, and then what is the network it needs to connect to. If there's any additional properties that need to be configured, we'll configure those. And then, of course, at the end, we cross our fingers and hope everything works as it's supposed to. By and large, it will. Are there going to be instances where a machine doesn't come over cleanly? Absolutely. That's why you need to plan up front, you need to plan effectively, and you need to make sure you have a backup plan as well, just in case something doesn't go the way you expect. These are all things that we do when we run these projects. So PowerShell, well, there's the PowerShell command to move one VM, Hyper-V, or from VMware over into Hyper-V. Now, you'll notice that string is awful long. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not doing it with PowerShell. Could you? Absolutely. Me, I'm going to stick to running it through the GUI. What if we're going to migrate from Azure or migrate from VMware to Azure or Azure Stack HCI? Well, as I mentioned before, Microsoft has what they call the Azure Migrate Appliance. Basically, it's a virtual machine that you download that's been pre-configured for you. That virtual machine requires a minimum of 32 gigs of RAM and 8 virtual CPUs, and as well as 80 gigabytes of disk space. That's the minimum requirement. If you want to do migrations at scale, you're going to need to pop that up a little bit. What that does is it will assess your existing environment. So let's look at the entire VMware estate that we have out there. What do we have available to migrate? What are the requirements around those migrations? Do we need to deal with things like various dependencies between application servers? What about networking? All those things come together and give us the assessment out of that Azure Migrate Appliance. There's readiness checks in there. Do we have the latest patch levels that we need? Is the operating system up to date? Any potential remediations that are available to us? So are there things that we can fix prior to migration to enable us to migrate more servers than not, or fix a server prior to migration so that it's able to be migrated? One of the other things is if you're looking at migrating to Azure, the Azure Migrate Appliance will go through, do that assessment, and also provide cost estimates for Azure. So it'll look at your environment and say, you got this many servers that have this many CPU cores associated with them and this much memory and this much disk. And if you were to drop that all in IaaS and infrastructure as a service in Azure, here's what your monthly run cost is going to look like. Again, it's an estimate, but it's going to be pretty close. The other thing is every server instance that is in the source environment will get a confidence rating. That confidence rating is designed to tell you, yeah, we believe with 80% certainty that this is going to migrate over fine, or this is going to migrate over with 95% certainty. Or take a look at this server. It's only got about a 20% certainty, and there's a bunch of remediations associated with it. Maybe we should clean that thing up before we try to migrate it. So all that comes out of that assessment. A really good job at helping us understand what's there, what do we need to do prior to migration, what do we need to address, and by the way, when you get into Azure, here's what the run cost is going to look like. Now, that run cost is going to be generally, as I recall, that run cost is going to be associated with the pay-go model. So we can also look at that run cost and look at it in terms of what if we did commits on 65% of our servers and we did a 1 or a 3 year commit on that. How much can we save on that? Or potentially, if we were to put in place an Azure savings plan, are there ways we can reduce our cost there as well? So again, giving us a lot of information in terms of what can we do to make sure this migration is as successful as possible. And that's regardless of whether you're migrating to the Azure cloud or to Azure Stack HCI. Although the cost estimate's not as important when you're going to Azure Stack HCI, confidence ratings, the readiness, the dependency checks, the potential remediations, all those things that are also just as critical when you're moving to Azure Stack HCI as when you're moving to Azure. So very good information for us to get up front, very good information for us to review and make sure we understand. From an Azure Migrate perspective, the migration itself can be done either agentless or agent-based. Agentless means we don't need to install anything on the guest OS prior to migration. There's some nuances between, do I need to go agentless or should I go agent-based? Agent-based means we need to install a migration agent onto that guest VM as part of the migration. Again, what's right? Well, I don't know. It depends. We've got to get in and take a look at the environment to figure out what is right. Some instances, everything can be done agentless. Other instances, we're looking at these things can go agentless and these things need to go agent-based because of whatever parameter. The agent base does give us some additional granular detail. So one of the things it looks at is how many connections are tied into that server right now. What's the latency look like? Are there things that we need to be aware of in terms of how much data is transferred in and out of that server? One of the things that is required if we're going to do agent-based is we have to have a log analytics environment in Azure so that we can gather that data and then query it to pull back information and reports associated with things like the number of connections, the latency, and any data transfer requirements that we need to look at. So again, a couple different ways to slice it. There's no one right way for everything, but we can figure out what makes the most sense based on what's in your environment. With Azure Stack HCI, it's an on-premises environment. As I mentioned before, it's connected to Azure. We can do the migration either using SCVMM or, as of October, it's in public preview right now. And remember, whenever anything's in preview for Microsoft, you may as well just say in your mind, that means it's still in beta. So it's not necessarily going to be 100% the feature set or look exactly the way when it comes out in final general availability is what you're seeing in preview model. That being said, the I've seen so far is pretty positive on it. So again, you can do it with SCVMM. That's the tried and tested tool set that's been around for years. It works. We know it works. Or we can do it through Azure Migrate. On-premises hardware, basically, we're migrating with an Azure Stack HCI environment from VMware to Hyper-V. The difference is, in an Azure Stack HCI environment, it is a certified platform, certified by Microsoft. They've worked with all the hardware vendors to make sure it's certified, but it also is directly connected to Azure. So in the future, if we want to migrate those workloads into Azure, we can do that very much more easily from an Azure Stack HCI than from a traditional Hyper-V environment. The other thing is you've got capacity flex in there. So if I need to get extra CPU cycles for an application server because it's end-of-month processing, or the example I always love to use in the past was if you run a flower shop, there's 2 weeks of the year where your business is 10 times what it is the rest of the year. The week before Mother's Day and the week before Valentine's Day, your business is 10 times what it is the other 50 weeks of the year. So that flex capacity allows you to flex up into the Azure environment for additional compute resources for those 2 weeks. And then the rest of the year, when you don't need them, you come back down to your Azure Stack environment and you're only paying for what you use, pay by the drink, so to speak. It also allows for DR capabilities into Azure through Azure Site Recovery. And mind you, you can use Azure Site Recovery in a traditional Hyper-V environment as well. There's some nuances in terms of the configuration, how you set it up, and how you make sure that things will fail over when they need to. But again, from an Azure Stack HCI environment, because it's already built into the platform, it's a lot easier, it's a lot more streamlined, it's a lot more simplified. So how do you know what's right for you? Well, first off, let's make sure we understand what the vision is at your organization for IT services. What is the move in the future? Have you looked at cloud? Do you have things in the cloud already? Is it time to look at migrating to the cloud? And mind you, on premises in our world, doesn't matter whether that's in your data center or whether it's in a colo facility, as far as we're concerned, that's still on premises. That's not in the cloud. But my colo facility said it's a private cloud. Yeah, it's still on premises as far as we're concerned. The next thing we need to do, once we understand that vision, then we can start to figure out what's the right target environment. We're never going cloud. We're not ready for it. We don't want to use that new cloud technology. It scares me. Okay, that's fine. We'll keep you on premises with Hyper-V, and we'll start to look at what that looks like. Well, we're not sure. We know cloud is in the future, but we're not sure when. Let's start to figure that out. Okay, maybe Azure Stack HCI is the right answer for you. We've already decided we're going to move everything out to the cloud. We're done with on-premises data centers. We don't want to have a colo anymore. We want this stuff somewhere else. Okay, maybe Azure's the right cloud for you. Let's figure that out. The next thing we need to do, once we understand what that vision is from a long-term perspective and how we can meet those goals, let's take a look at that on-premises estate. What do you have in there? What are the things we need to account for? What are the dependencies? What kind of data flows do we need to look at? Are there latency concerns? Are there things we need to worry about that maybe are behind a little bit that we need to bring up to speed before we migrate those? Are there any workloads in your environment that won't move to the cloud for whatever reason? Maybe it's an application performance issue where that application has to be on premises and close to its endpoints in order for it to perform appropriately. It's okay. We can account for that. We just need to make sure we understand. Are there things that we may be able to modernize, and maybe we can use platform as a service instead of infrastructure as a service? Things like SQL Server. Can we reduce your spend in SQL licensing by reducing the number of SQL servers you have, leveraging platform as a service, and also reduce the run costs associated with it? But don't get me wrong, there are applications that will not work in a SQL PaaS environment, but there's plenty of applications that will. And for those applications that will, you can recognize some significant cost savings by moving to SQL Platform as a Service. Plus, Platform as a Service, there's less overhead associated with the own, operate, and maintain cycles than running a traditional VM in Azure. The last thing is, let's make sure we get all the insight we need. Let's set up an Azure Migrate appliance. Let's get that on site. Let's fire it up. Let's run it. Let's see what we see and start to make some determinations around what the right motion forward looks like for you and what are the things that we need to account for. Part of a deployment plan in terms of testing, in terms of piloting, in terms of making sure that we've accounted for all the various parameters we need to account for to make that migration as seamless, streamlined as possible. So, are there any questions out there? Courtney, anything in the Q&A?
No, not seeing any questions here in the Q&A. So if we don't have any other questions, thank you, Tim, for sharing what it looks like to transition to Hyper-V. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I will be sending out the recording of this webinar shortly, and you can stay connected with us on LinkedIn for updates on future webinars. We're at Solutions for Networks.
And
Thanks,
certainly
Tim.
my email address is on the opening slide there. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out directly or reach out to your account manager and have them get a hold of me. But we appreciate everybody attending this afternoon. Hopefully everybody has a great holiday season. Thank you again. Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you.